All right. What's up, y'all? You know what it is. Black Masculinist news for the day, the Onyx Report. Welcome back. Hope your day is going well. Today, got a little treat that came out yesterday in an article on iai.tv. And I'll try to remember to put the URL in the description. If I forget, remind me and I can go ahead and do that. But this is a piece by our very own Dr. Tommy J. Curry, a little over 2,900 words. And this was written, as I said, on July 16th. And this is IAI News, right? And the title of the article is Racism and the Equality Delusion. Now, the thing about this is Dr. Curry weighing in on the whole issue of critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is not an area that I teach. It is an area that I studied in graduate school. It's not one of my principal areas. I have colleagues that have done a lot of that work. If you're interested in really exploring this question, you can go check out the Green Gorillas channel. He recently did a dive in on critical race theory. I posted this on both, really on Facebook, Twitter, as well as YouTube when Dr. Curry came out with it. And I did a 5-minute, I don't know if it was 5 minutes, but in my mind, it was a 5-minute overview of the issue and a conversation on one of BGS's shatter points on YouTube. And it was really an impromptu thing where some of the brothers in the comments actually asked me to pop up and just kind of give a generic explanation, which I did. And I let people know that's not my primary area, but this is overall what's going on. And really, in many ways, Dr. Curry, with more detail, kind of affirms a lot of what I said. But even though I put this article up for people to read, one of the things that brought me to YouTube is an understanding that a lot of people just don't, whether it's because they don't have the time, they're not able to, a variety of reasons they don't. So here's what I'm going to actually do today. I'm going to read it to you. So while you're working, while you're doing other things, you can actually listen to the article and check it out. And I would still urge you to go to the site and look at it for yourself, right? But I thought I would take the time to kind of get this across to you. And there'll be some light commentary, but I'm actually going to try and keep that down because I really want you to hear how Dr. Curry himself explains this particular phenomenon, right? So as it's listed here, let's see, they actually start with a bit of an intro, and it reads, "We tend to think that racism will one day be overcome. This belief in incremental progress isn't shared by many Black scholars. The much maligned and misunderstood founder of critical race theory, Derrick Bell, pronounced racism a permanent feature of American society. His argument that the very foundations of liberal democracy in the United States make equality between white and Black people impossible might be hard to accept, but it remains valid," writes Tommy Curry. Right? So it continues. "The recent debate over critical race theory in the United States is more evidence of the irreconcilability of anti-Black racism within democracies controlled and managed by whites. Following the lead of former President Donald Trump, many states have passed legislation demanding that conversations about anti-Black racism and the violence of whites be banned from primary school and university curricula. These policies aim to not only silence the criticisms made by Black and other non-white scholars over the last 3 centuries, but hope to repair the alleged damage Black radicalism has had on the ethos of virtues of white civilizations, or ethos and virtues of white civilization. Excuse me. There we go. At the same time, actually, you know what? Let me pull this up so a number of you can follow along with me there. So you don't have to stare at my mug while I go through this, but there might be sections you want to look at more in depth, right? At the same time, talks of critical race theory has been adopted and gentrified by academics without any relevant training or engagement with the canonical works of this intellectual tradition. As a result, critical race theory has been watered down, even as it is being demonized by the right. It is therefore important to underline its unique approach to understanding the relationship between race, power, and liberal democratic institutions. Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. One of the key theses of critical race theory is that is that racial equality under the current system of liberal American constitutional democracy is impossible. Right? I'm not going to read over the larger red components, but this is one of the things I was saying when I was talking on BGS's platform about this. I was saying you have a watering down that's happening as liberal whites have entered the discussion and began to do their own brand of critical race theory in universities. And this happens a lot. It happens a lot. It's happened with intersectionality. It's happened with all forms of Black radicalism. It's happened with LGBT theory, Black LGBT theory. You know, once it becomes something that liberal whites begin to internalize, they water it down and couch it in their own language. And that's usually a language that's less threatening to the mainstream. Anyway, so he continues, the foundations of critical race theory. Since the passing of Brown versus Board of Education and the end of the Cold War, the conversation concerning the place of Black peoples within empires and colonies disappeared from the forefront of scholarly analysis. Many institutions of higher education followed Harvard's core curriculum report, which urged the creation of a liberal arts curricula emphasizing the triumph and superiority of Western philosophy and the civilization to stave off the racial and anti-colonial dissent of the 1960s and 70s. It should come as no great surprise then that the debate over critical race theory does not accurately represent the actual intellectual tradition started by Derrick Bell in the late 1970s as a response to the failure of the American Civil Rights Movement and in the Integrationist Project, but rather emphasizes the dangers associated with educating young people in white societies about the failure of democracy and the tyranny that white populations have lethally imposed on the darker races for the last several centuries. Now, shout out to my boy Ian. He had an exchange with Dr. Curry where they did talk about Kimberly Crenshaw and her contributions to it. But from what Dr. Curry said, it looks like Kimberly Crenshaw did name this critical race theory as a law student while she was still in law school. But the bulk of the foundation of this was developed much earlier by Dr. Bell himself. All right, continuing. Derrick Bell is widely credited as being the founder of critical race theory. In 1976, Derrick Bell asserted that Brown v. Board of Education ultimately failed to provide equality and democratic governance to Black Americans. His argument, like that of his mentor, Judge Robert L. Carter, insisted that it was not segregation that caused the negative sociological and psychological consequences of racism, but white supremacy, or the erroneous belief that whites were meant to possess and manage the lives and labor of Black people in the United States as they had previously done in colonies across the world. Bell was adamant that the policies of racial redress are still based on the sense, no less deeply held when it is unconscious, that America is a white nation and the white dominance over Blacks is natural, right, and necessary, as well as profitable and satisfying. This pervasive belief, the very essence of racism, remains a viable and valuable national resource. Influenced by the Black radical tradition of Black militancy and semi-colonial analysis, Derrick Bell came to believe that racism was a permanent and unchanging aspect of American society. Bell insisted that the civil rights legislation and initiatives were merely symbolic, and even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. So one can simply look at the election of Barack Obama to the presidency or the new VP, right, Kamala Harris. What lasting entrenched changes on the benefit of people of African descent, particularly ADOS, as one might call them here in the United States, or FBA, whatever the terms people are most comfortable with in terms of identifying a lineage of people who experienced slavery in North America. What have those elections wrought that provides lasting change? And how did the Black community in particular fare once those people were elected? Did their lot in life improve? Seems to prove Derrick Bell correct. Continuing, it has come as a great surprise to whites that the Black scholars that have informed critical race theory do not believe in the promises of Western democracy or the delusion that racial equality is possible in these white democratic societies. Since the 19th century, Black scholars have insisted upon the permanence of white racism in the U.S. and other white empires. Contrary to the academic depictions of Black American figures as hopeful and invested in the democratic experiment of America, Black thinkers insisted that anti-Blackness stains Black Americans into perpetuity. Throughout the 1800s, historic black figures associated black liberation with the Haitian Revolution, not incorporation in the US. In America and Europe, the liberal democratic ideal insists that the race problem between blacks and whites will inevitably be resolved with the passing of more time. This idea of automatic progress insists that the death and dying of black people, while constant, slowly moves white populations towards greater social consciousness and racial understanding. This optimism regarding anti-black racism, or the set of racial antipathies wedding blackness and Africanity to inferiority, savagery, and disposability, depends ultimately on the ability of white democracies to manage the outrage and political dissent Black American and European populations have to their disproportionate deaths, disadvantages, and poverty compared to the white citizenry. Next section, the allure of equality. Right? Line this up here. Incorporation within white liberal democratic societies demands an acceptance of liberal ideology by its citizenry. The offensiveness of CRT is that it makes racism a permanent and dynamic force that manifests alongside the pretense of democratic values and expression. Whereas white liberal thought locates itself as a progressive ethical stance, motivating social reform against the decadent paleo conservatism of its respective society, CRT suggests that the liberal conservative distinction is illusory and merely a disagreement over the most efficacious strategies of racial rule. To maintain the pretense of racial equality, liberals demand racism to remain abstract, right, and equal to other forms of sexual and economic marginalization. As Gary Peller has explained, liberal integrationist ideology is structured so that some social practices are taken out of the economy of race relations and understood to be undistorted by racial power. In this way, democratic liberalism removes the exceptionality of race and racism by making integration/inclusion the universal tenet of social progress. Consequently, any thinking that justifies exclusion of or resembles racial segregation is deemed racist. For the liberal, the black nationalist responding to the racist violence of the police, the KKK, or even white feminists is deemed just as racist, if not more oppressive than the initial white perpetrators of violence. For example, this up a little. The Black Panther Party is often depicted as the black version of the KKK, despite its focus on education, medical care, and even women's rights. The very idea of black militancy is equated with tyranny, violence, and black male savagery, despite black militancy responding to the initial violence of white vigilantism and terrorism. This is in stark contrast to liberal movements such as feminism that had state-sponsored involvement, historically endorsed the murder of black men and boys, and the carceral state being hailed as successful progressive movements presently. Throughout multiple disciplines, the racist origins of liberalism, white women's rights, or even the Brown v. Board of Education decision remain hidden by the dominant narrative of racial progress. Equality, then, is a yearning for inclusion into this society that is said to offer protection and recognition for blacks despite the death and dying of black populations. Over the last several years, the public executions of black men and boys in the United States have energized conversations around racism in the United States and the UK. While America continues to insist that the deaths of black people do not indicate a significant flaw in the structure of American society, Great Britain insists that race is simply not a fundamental aspect of social inequality in its country. Despite the evidence showing that black citizens and migrant populations experience higher rates of death, negative police encounters, incarceration, and discrimination, the official position of American and British governments is that racism is no longer a significant obstacle to the success and progress of black people in these respective countries. According to Anthony Farley, liberalism will not acknowledge and yet is perpetually fascinated by its creations. Liberalism makes a fetish of its abstract equalities and pays no attention to the material inequalities that give them the power to make their fantasies about us, blacks, a reality. The idea of racial equality in the US or UK is a fantasy, an imaginative allure that requires black people to ignore the violence and death of their people in front of their eyes for the hope that one day black people will no longer be required to pay the cost of citizenship with their lives. This will unfortunately never be the case, since racism is, at its core, the manifestation of the social processes and concurrent logics that facilitate the death and dying of racially subjected peoples. Racism is a social process that demands the extinguishing of Black life. Racism craves death. It is constructed, then legitimized through cultural and individual complacency. And this process of creating and adapting hierarchies of social dominance and group-based hierarchies cannot be fiated away by the pretentiousness of academic discourse or aspirations of equality. Liberal theory relies on the ability of rational, moral, and free individuals to choose abstract principles that are thought to remedy social inequality. In practice, however, these abstractions rarely result in material change. The principle of equality has been used to challenge the legality of affirmative action for Blacks while affording white women the greatest share of the educational and economic benefits of the civil rights programs. In a white supremacist society, remedies, programs of violence, and even abstractions continue to preserve and advance the interests of the dominant white group. Next section, gentrification of critical race theory. The assimilation of critical race theory, CRT, within philosophy departments, liberal arts colleges, and the popular parlance as any study of race has weakened the intellectual tradition authored by its original theorists almost beyond recognition. The readiness of white liberals to tout themselves and their scholarship as off-label uses of CRT methodology has institutionally solidified the marketability of critical theory/philosophies of race. A spin-off of CRT that makes no mention of Derrick Bell's work, his analysis, or the foundational economic critiques of the American neo-colonial apparatus. The result of this incorporation is not only the de-radicalization of the political ideas and motivations of Black peoples, but a stratagem designed to redirect the pessimism of Black critiques against American democracy and replace it with optimism and the possibility of democratic reform despite the death and dying of Black populations within their respective nations. Powerful. Damn. The controversy surrounding CRT is not about the verifiability of its claims or the accuracy of attributing social inequalities to anti-Black racism. The debate over CRT is at its heart the assertion through censorship and punishment that Black people do not and should not have the ability to indict the historical legacy of white civilization and the virtue of white individuals. Insofar as the descent of Black people and other non-white victims of white violence become popularly endorsed, the white managerial structures of American and British societies remain a limit on the discussion of racism and critiques of white societies. As such, the failures of Black people, their poverty, death, and underrepresentation cannot be attributed to their history of exclusion and oppression, only their cultural inadequacies or personal failures. In short, the white managerial classes have decided that censorship is necessary to curb not only undesirable speech, but unwanted social empowerment among Black, brown, and indigenous populations who seek a redistribution of power and economic resources. The effect of which is that Black peoples, despite the rhetoric of equality, remain subject and not a citizen within white democratic societies. Okay? Building upon the militant and revolutionary strategies of Black radicals throughout the 19th and 20th century, critical race theory invites the oppressed to creatively engage the praxis of struggle against systems of racist and neo-colonial oppression. When Bell invokes the words of Miss Fiona MacDonald, "I live to harass white folks," he offers the reader a glimpse into the perpetual struggle that Black people are committed towards, regardless of the time they find themselves in. To many white liberal thinkers, a life committed to the tragic fate of struggle and sempiternal nature of white supremacy is much too high a burden to bear. Consequently, white theory stops at the horizon of Black thought. Said differently, white theory and philosophy has adamantly refused to entertain how one can think or have political theory under the permanence of anti-Black racism in the United States. I have focused on the idea of disempowerment and the cultural logic as the basis of thinking a positive social political program in my own work. But this challenge, the need to think through the reality of racist oppression and violence, is refused by white scholars and canons because there is an insistence upon white virtue and liberal principles being the panacea of racism within white democracies. Okay? And then, of course, there is a nice extended bibliography that you may sift through with several works of his own being cited, most particularly The Man Not. You can see the works of Jim Sidanius, right? Social dominance, an intergroup theory of social hierarchy and oppression. He also writes another piece you might want to look into if you're interested. Will the real CRT please stand up? The dangers of philosophical contributions to CRT, written back in 2009. And Shut Your Mouth When You're Talking to Me, silencing the idealist school of critical race theory through a cultural logic turn in jurisprudence. Right, this coming out in 2012. So shout out to Dr. Curry. I'm not going to hold you guys too much longer. And like I said, I wasn't going to really interrupt too much because I think Dr. Curry speaks for himself quite well. But I did want to get this across for those of you who are interested, who wanted to know what this dynamic was about, but may not, for one reason or another, be able to sit down and actually go through the article. So I hope I helped. Apologies for kind of tripping through some of it. I don't have the greatest vision these days, but either way, tell me what you think. Drop a word in the comments section. And again, shout out to Dr. Curry. Peace to you all. Have a good one.